When you drift through the Thousand Islands on the St. Lawrence River, somewhere between the American and Canadian shores, you'll see hundreds of private islands dotting the dark water. Most pass by in quiet anonymity. But then, rising from one particular island like something out of a medieval dream, you'll see towers. Stone towers with red-tiled roofs, turrets reaching toward the sky. And if you're close enough, you might catch the sound of Westminster chimes echoing across the water from a clock tower that local legend claims is made of solid gold. This is Singer Castle, and its story is one of unimaginable wealth, architectural obsession, family tragedy, and the dark price of Gilded Age ambition. Today, if you visit Dark Island, you can walk through 28 rooms filled with hidden corridors, spy holes, and a dungeon accessible only through a trap door. You can stand in the Great Hall, where medieval armor guards marble fireplaces, or peer into the walnut-paneled library, where pulling the right book once triggered a mechanism that opened passages within the walls themselves. You can explore corridors where servants once moved unseen, watching wealthy guests through grates. But what you cannot see are the ghosts. The family that built this fortress. The man who rose from poverty to become one of the wealthiest industrialists in America, only to watch death claim those he loved most. The children who inherited a fortune so vast they would tear each other apart, fighting over it. The whispered rumors of bootlegging during Prohibition. The slow, inevitable decay that comes when dreams outlive the dreamers. This is the true story of Singer Castle. And like the hidden passages twisting through its stone walls, it is darker than you might imagine. If you enjoy uncovering the darker histories hidden behind grand estates, you're welcome to subscribe and explore more with me. It begins not on a romantic island in the St. Lawrence River, but in a modest home in Boston, Massachusetts, on December 20th, 1851. Frederick Gilbert Bourne was born into a family of preachers and patriots. His father, Reverend George Washington Bourne, was a man of God. His grandfather's family had produced soldiers who fought in the American Revolutionary War. His mother, Harriet Gilbert Bourne, came from Portland, Maine, and raised her children with the stern values of New England propriety. But Frederick's childhood was not destined to be easy or comfortable. When he was still a young boy, around the age of 9, his family moved to New York City. The bustling metropolis was a world away from Boston's more refined streets. Here, among the crowds and chaos of America's fastest-growing city, young Frederick discovered something inside himself. A hunger, not for gold, like the thousands rushing west to California, but for knowledge, for opportunity, for something more than his circumstances seemed to promise. By the time Frederick was 11 years old, he was already singing in the choir at Holy Trinity Church, his voice rising above the congregation. He was described as having a voracious thirst for knowledge, spending every spare moment reading about mechanical work, history, science, and adventure. He was fascinated by how things worked, how machines moved, how systems connected. But knowledge alone doesn't pay bills. When Frederick's father died in 1872, leaving his mother widowed and his younger sisters without support, Frederick was forced to make a choice that would define the rest of his life. He was only 14 years old, the age when most boys today are thinking about high school dances and summer vacations. Frederick Gilbert Bourne had to become a man. He left school and went to work. His first job was with the Atlantic Submarine Wrecking Company, a rough-and-tumble operation that salvaged ships and cargo from the depths. It was hard work, dangerous work, but Frederick learned quickly. He moved through positions. Cashier, bookkeeper, clerk at the Mercantile Library of New York. He saved every penny he could. He supported his mother and sisters. And all the while, He kept learning. Frederick loved music. It was in his blood, passed down from his father, the preacher, and refined in church choirs throughout his youth. So when he joined the Mendelssohn Glee Club, a prestigious musical society in New York, he was simply following his passion. He had no idea this decision would change the entire trajectory of his life. It was there, among the harmonies and sheet music, that he met Alfred Corning Clark. Alfred was not just another singer. He was the son of Edward Cabot Clark, one of the wealthiest men in America. Edward Clark, alongside the famous inventor Isaac Merritt Singer, had co-founded the Singer Sewing Machine Company, a business that was transforming the world. The sewing machine was revolutionizing textile production, liberating women from hours of hand stitching, and making ready-made clothing affordable for ordinary families. And Edward Clark controlled half of it. Frederick and Alfred became friends, despite their vastly different backgrounds. One, a working-class clerk supporting his widowed mother. The other, the heir to a manufacturing fortune. The two young men found common ground in music, in conversation, in mutual respect. Alfred saw something in Frederick that others might have missed. Intelligence, integrity, ambition tempered with humility, work ethic paired with vision. In 1880, Alfred did something that would change both their lives. He recommended to his father that Frederick Gilbert Bourne be brought into the family's real estate business and made construction manager of a revolutionary new apartment building being built on Manhattan's Upper West Side, overlooking Central Park. The building was called the Dakota, and it would become one of the most famous addresses in New York City. Frederick threw himself into the work. He managed hundreds of workers, coordinated with architects, solved problems on the fly. The Dakota rose floor by floor, a testament to his organizational genius. And as he worked, Alfred frequently asked him to attend Singer Sewing Machine Company board meetings in his place. When Alfred traveled abroad, Frederick, still in his 20s, found himself sitting in rooms with some of the most powerful businessmen in America. When Edward Clark died in 1882, Frederick was appointed manager of the Clark estate at the age of 31. 3 years later, in 1885, he was made secretary of the Singer Manufacturing Company. And in 1889, at the young age of 38, Frederick Gilbert Bourne became the 5th president of the Singer Manufacturing Company. The boy who had started with nothing now controlled one of the world's first truly multinational corporations. What Frederick Bourne did with Singer between 1889 and 1905 was nothing short of revolutionary. He didn't just run a company. He transformed the entire concept of what a global business could be. Under his leadership, Singer became what historians now call perhaps the first modern multinational industrial enterprise of any nationality. Bourne saw what others didn't. While most businessmen focused on making products, Bourne focused on making products accessible. He pioneered the installment plan, allowing ordinary families to buy sewing machines by making small payments over time rather than paying the full price up front. This single innovation turned sewing machines from luxury items into household necessities. It planted the seeds for women's economic liberation, giving them tools to earn income from home-based sewing businesses. He expanded Singer's global footprint aggressively, establishing factories and sales offices on every continent. He vertically integrated the company, controlling every step of production from raw materials to final sale. He commissioned architect Ernest Flagg to design the Singer Building in Manhattan, a towering skyscraper that, when completed in 1908, was the tallest building in the world. By the time Frederick Bourne retired as president in 1905, he had accumulated a personal fortune estimated at $42 to $43 million, the equivalent of well over $1 billion in today's currency. He maintained an apartment at the Dakota that occupied the entire first floor. He owned a 2,000-acre estate called Indian Neck Hall in Oakdale, Long Island, next door to William Kissam Vanderbilt's Idle Hour. He owned a 375-acre hunting preserve near Montauk. He had an apartment on Jekyll Island, Georgia, home of the famous Millionaires Club. And then, in 1902, he bought a small, rocky island in the Thousand Islands region of the St. Lawrence River. It was called Dark Island. Frederick Bourne didn't set out to build just a hunting lodge. He wanted something more, something that captured his imagination the way music, engineering, and business had captured it throughout his life. So he turned to his friend, the architect Ernest Flagg, the same man who had designed Indian Neck Hall and would later design the Singer Building. Flagg was a graduate of the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, one of the most prestigious architectural schools in the world. He had developed what he called a modern French Renaissance style, blending classical European elegance with American practicality. But for Dark Island, Flagg needed inspiration that went deeper than style. He needed a story. Flagg's wife used to read to him while he relaxed. And in 1902, as Bourne was asking him to design the Dark Island hunting lodge, Flagg's wife happened to be reading him Woodstock, a historical novel by Sir Walter Scott, published in 1826. Scott's novel told the tale of Woodstock Palace in Oxfordshire, England, a mysterious castle built as a hunting lodge for royalty, filled with secret passageways, hidden tunnels, underground labyrinths, and even a dungeon. The book described Gothic architecture, Norman foot soldiers standing guard, and passages that allowed servants to move unseen through the walls. As Flagg listened to his wife read night after night, the vision began to form in his mind. He would bring Scott's fictional Woodstock Palace to life. But he would build it here, on a rocky island in upstate New York. He would build it for Frederick Bourne. The original Woodstock Palace had been destroyed during the English Civil War in the mid-1600s. A few decades later, Blenheim Palace was built near where it once stood. Blenheim, where Consuelo Vanderbilt, daughter of Bourne's Long Island neighbor, would endure a miserable marriage to the 9th Duke of Marlborough. The connections between these Gilded Age titans and European aristocracy ran deep, tangled, and often tragic. But Frederick Bourne didn't want to copy any existing castle. He made that clear to Flagg from the beginning. He wanted something original, something that had never existed before. So Flagg took Scott's literary descriptions and transformed them into architectural reality, creating what would eventually be called the Castle of Mysteries. Construction on what Bourne would call the Towers began in the spring of 1903. The scale of the project was staggering. Over 100 masons were employed year-round, working through bitter winters and sweltering summers. The rose granite that formed the castle's bones was quarried from nearby Oak Island, the same quarry that supplied stone for the famous Bolt Castle, another Thousand Islands mansion being completed at almost the same time. Sandstone came from quarries in Hammond. Red roof tiles were imported all the way from Spain. Copper guttering was installed to withstand the harsh weather. Italian craftsmen were brought in to carve elaborate stonework and create vaulted ceilings in the Great Hall. The island itself presented enormous challenges. Dark Island earned its name from early navigators, who saw its high granite peak covered with giant pine trees, creating a dark silhouette against the sky. The 7 acres of rocky terrain offered little in the way of soil for gardening or landscaping. So Bourne had his team bring over 2,000 loads of topsoil from Canada, ferrying it across the water to cover the barren rock and create gardens where flowers could grow. The construction cost just under $500,000, approximately $13 to $15 million in today's currency. and what it created was unlike anything else in America. The castle rose 5 stories high, crowned by a clock tower that stood even taller. 4 enormous clock faces, each 6 feet in diameter, looked out over the river in all directions. Westminster chimes were installed to ring every 15 minutes, their sound carrying across the water. Local folklore quickly spread that the clock faces were made of solid gold, though this was never true. But the legend persisted, adding to the castle's mystique. Inside, the castle contained 28 rooms, 10 fireplaces, 8 bathrooms, and a labyrinth of secret passageways that would have made Sir Walter Scott himself proud. When visitors arrived by boat at one of Dark Island's 3 boathouses, the northern boathouse could accommodate Bourne's 100-foot steam yacht. They would climb flagstone steps to a massive wooden door. Passing through, they entered the Great Hall, measuring 39 feet by 33 feet, with ceilings soaring overhead. The Great Hall was designed to evoke medieval grandeur. Vaulted ceilings were elaborately carved by Italian masons. Sturdy stone pillars and archways lined the room. A large marble fireplace dominated one wall. And standing guard, exactly as described in Scott's Woodstock, were suits of armor. Norman foot soldiers holding great swords and maces, forever vigilant. Flagg had pulled a passage directly from Scott's novel to inspire this room. Quote, "The way therefore lay open to the great hall or outer vestibule of the lodge. One end was entirely occupied by a gallery which had in ancient times served to accommodate the musicians and minstrels. There was a clumsy staircase, and in each angle of the ascent was placed by way of sentinel the figure of a Norman foot soldier. Their arms were buff jackets or shirts of mail, round bucklers with spikes in the center, and buskins which adorned and defended the feet and ankles. These wooden warders held great swords or maces in their hands, like military guards on duty." End quote. But the real marvel of Singer Castle wasn't what you could see. It was what was hidden. The library, accessed through an archway off the Great Hall, was paneled entirely in walnut. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes from the Bourne family's personal collection. A marble fireplace warmed the room. And next to that fireplace, if you knew where to look, there was a panel concealing the entrance to a network of hidden corridors. At one time, pulling a specific book from a nearby shelf would trigger a mechanism, causing the panel to swing open and reveal the beginning of a labyrinth that ran throughout the entire castle. These corridors wound through the walls, connecting rooms, allowing movement from floor to floor without being seen. They were narrow, dimly lit, creating a maze that visitors today still find both thrilling and unsettling. But these corridors weren't built for drama. They served a practical purpose. They allowed servants to move through the house without disturbing the Bourne family and their guests. Staff could slip through the walls, emerge quietly into rooms, check on whether drinks needed refilling or the next course of dinner should be served, and then vanish back into the passages like ghosts. In the drawing room, a portrait of King Charles II of England hung over the marble fireplace. But this portrait had a secret. It could be tilted back from behind, allowing someone hidden in the walls to peer into the room and spy on the guests gathered there. Viewing grates were built into walls throughout the castle for the same purpose, allowing observation from within these hidden arteries. The breakfast room, added later, featured large Gothic windows on 3 sides that framed the river's beauty. Ships in the International Shipping Channel passed remarkably close to the south side of Dark Island, only about 100 feet away, their massive hulls sometimes seeming close enough to touch from the castle windows. The kitchen, positioned in a service wing with views of the Canadian shoreline, connected to the formal dining room above via a dumbwaiter and spiral staircase. A tunnel also linked the two spaces, allowing staff to deliver food without being seen by dinner guests. The most ominous feature, however, lay in Bourne's tower office. There, concealed in the floor, was a trap door leading down to a dungeon, an actual dungeon built into the foundation, dark and cold and unmistakably medieval. Why was it built? No one knows for certain. Some say it was simply part of Flagg's commitment to recreating Woodstock Palace in every detail. Others whisper darker theories, that it stored contraband during Prohibition, or served purposes the family never publicly acknowledged. The dungeon remains silent and enigmatic, keeping its secrets locked in stone. For Frederick, his wife Emma, and their children, Dark Island was paradise. The family had lost 3 children to illness and accidents. Frederick Jr., Louisa, and Kenneth all died young, breaking their parents' hearts. But 9 survived. Arthur, May, Marion, Alfred, Florence, George, Marjorie, Helen, and Howard. These children, along with Emma, were the center of Frederick's world. The Bournes were obsessed with boats and yachting. Frederick served as Commodore of the New York Yacht Club from 1903 to 1905, sponsoring entries in the America's Cup race. He owned numerous steam vessels, some of which can still be seen at the Antique Boat Museum in Clayton, New York. At Dark Island, the family kept 5 motorboats, 3 rowing skiffs, and 2 canoes at any given time, not counting the larger yachts docked at the massive boathouses. They owned 2/3 of nearby Eel Island, using it for hunting duck and pheasant. Private trains would bring hunting parties of up to 15 guests from New York City to spend weekends at the castle, stalking game through the forests and returning triumphantly to display their trophies in the trophy room, another space circumnavigated by secret passageways. Fishing was a constant pastime. The waters around Dark Island were perfect for sport fishing, with depths varying dramatically. Very deep on one side of the island, shallow on the other. Largemouth bass and northern pike were abundant, and the Bourne family spent countless hours on the water, competing to land the largest catch. The castle hosted elaborate parties. Guests from the highest echelons of American society came to Dark Island. Industrialists, financiers, artists. Frederick's neighbor on Inglenook Island was the famous American painter and sculptor Frederick Remington, who reportedly could hear construction work as the castle was being built and sent flowers to welcome the new neighbors upon its completion. Cornelius Vanderbilt and Vincent Astor were among those who visited. J.P. Morgan himself was a friend and correspondent. The elite of the Gilded Age sailed up to Dark Island's boathouses, climbed the stone steps, and entered a world of luxury, secrecy, and architectural wonder. But even in paradise, shadows were gathering. Emma Sparks Keeler Bourne, Frederick's beloved wife, was the granddaughter of Commodore Davidson, one of the founders of the New York Yacht Club. She had married Frederick on February 9, 1875, when both were young and the future seemed limitless. Together, they had built a life of unimaginable wealth and comfort. They had survived the heartbreaks of losing children. They had created 2 magnificent estates, Indian Neck Hall on Long Island and the Towers on Dark Island. But in 1916, Emma's health began to fail. On a day that started like any other in the grand halls of one of their estates, Emma Sparks Keeler Bourne died. The official cause was listed as natural causes, but her death devastated Frederick. After 41 years of marriage, he was alone. He buried his grief in the only way he knew how, by continuing to work, to build, to move forward. But the shadows were closing in faster than he could outrun them. In 1918, just 2 years after Emma's death, tragedy struck again. Howard Davidson Bourne, one of Frederick's surviving sons, died at the age of 25. He had never married. The cause of death was listed as illness, though details remained scarce. Howard's death was another brutal blow to a father who had already buried too many children. And then came 1919. By early 1919, Frederick Gilbert Bourne was 67 years old. He had retired from the presidency of Singer Manufacturing Company 14 years earlier, though he remained on the board of directors. He had more money than he could ever spend. He had estates, yachts, automobiles, including a 1906 Mercedes-Benz he loved to drive at dangerous speeds. He was once arrested for going 25 miles per hour in New York City, a scandalous velocity at the time. But he had also lost his wife and his son, and the world that had made him wealthy was changing rapidly. World War I had just ended, reshaping global politics. The Roaring Twenties were about to begin, bringing jazz, speakeasies, and a new generation that cared little for the staid values of the Gilded Age. Frederick fell ill in the late winter of 1919. For several months, his health deteriorated. He was cared for at Indian Neck Hall, his massive Long Island estate, where Emma had also died. On March 8, 1919, the day before his death, Frederick added a codicil to his will. He left $100,000 to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City and made 13 other substantial bequests. On March 9, 1919, Frederick Gilbert Bourne died. The official cause was listed as exhaustion and uremic poisoning, kidney failure. He was buried 4 days later, on March 13th, with a funeral attended by the most powerful men in America: William Avery Rockefeller Jr., Cornelius Neely Vanderbilt III, and J.P. Morgan Jr. The who's who of the Gilded Age came to mourn the man who had risen from poverty to stand among them as an equal. His estate was valued at between $42 to $43 million. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. Frederick Bourne left his vast fortune to be divided equally among his 7 surviving children: Arthur, May, Marianne, Alfred, Florence, George, and Marjorie. On paper, this seemed fair and straightforward. In reality, it ignited a legal war that would last for years. The children could not agree on how to distribute the estate. Arthur, the eldest surviving son and a director and treasurer of Singer Manufacturing Company, had his own ideas about who deserved what. The daughters, May, Marian, Florence, and Marjorie, had their own claims. George, who would eventually become president of Singer Manufacturing Company himself, sided with various factions at different times. Alfred maintained a quieter role, but was no less invested in the outcome. A newspaper at the time quipped that the Bourne children seemed happier to share their inheritance with their lawyers than with each other. Dark Island itself became a particular point of contention. In the summer of 1919, just months after Frederick's death, 2 of his daughters, Marjorie Bourne and May Strasburger, bought out their siblings for $389,000, becoming the new owners of the castle and island. This was far less than the property was worth, and it's not hard to imagine the resentment this created among the other siblings. In November 1921, the legal battles escalated. Marjorie filed a lawsuit against her brother Arthur in New York Supreme Court, accusing him of fraud related to the sale of Dark Island. The case made headlines. The details were ugly, public, and deeply embarrassing for a family that had always prided itself on propriety. The newspapers loved it. Here were the children of one of America's wealthiest men, blessed with fortunes most people couldn't even imagine, tearing each other apart in court. It was a spectacle of greed, entitlement, and sibling rivalry that proved wealth could not buy family harmony. Eventually, the cases were settled, though exactly how remains somewhat murky. What is clear is that Marjorie retained title to Dark Island. In 1921, her sister May and May's husband, Ralph Beaver Strasburger, gave Marjorie lifetime use of the island. It was an arrangement that would last for decades. In December 1926, Marjorie Bourne married Alexander Dallas Thayer, known to friends as Alec. He was 40 years old. She was 36. And they were both well past the age when most people of their class had married. But they were deeply in love, and Dark Island became their sanctuary. Alec was a noted tennis player who had competed in several matches at the U.S. Open during the 1920s. Marjorie, meanwhile, was a society woman with a taste for luxury and a sharp mind for business. Together, they transformed Dark Island from a hunting lodge into a true summer home. They made additions to the castle. They built a third-story apartment over the piazza, giving them a separate living space away from the guest rooms. The original wooden piazza was converted to stone to support the new wing's weight. They constructed a tennis court on the edge of the island, surrounded by water on 3 sides, a dramatic setting for matches. For Alec's birthday in 1928, Marjorie commissioned a squash court on the north side of the island, complete with a sports therapy room. And then there were the rumors. The 1920s in America were defined by Prohibition, the nationwide ban on the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. The 18th Amendment went into effect in January 1920, and it immediately created a massive black market. Rum running, the smuggling of liquor from Canada and the Caribbean into the United States, became a multi-million-dollar industry controlled by organized crime. Dark Island sat only a few yards south of the Canada-United States border. The border ran right through the St. Lawrence River. On the Canadian side, liquor was legal. On the American side, it was forbidden. And Dark Island was perfectly positioned between the two. Local legends persist to this day that Marjorie and Alec Thayer allowed Dark Island to be used for rum running during Prohibition. The castle's hidden corridors, the boathouses, the dungeon, all would have made ideal storage for contraband. The island's isolation meant that Coast Guard patrols would have difficulty monitoring it. And the Thayers' social connections meant they could move in circles where bootleggers and speakeasy owners mingled with industrialists and politicians. There is no definitive proof that Dark Island was used for smuggling. The Thayers were never arrested, never charged, never publicly accused. But the whispers persisted. The allure of a medieval fortress on a remote island, hidden cellars filled with Canadian whiskey, speedboats cutting through the night. It was perfect fodder for Roaring Twenties mythology. Whether or not the rumors were true, the Thayers lived well. They entertained lavishly. They maintained not just Dark Island, but also 3 yachts elsewhere, plus the 5 motorboats, 3 rowing skiffs, and 2 canoes kept at the island's boathouse. They spent 36 summers at Dark Island, their lives a seemingly endless summer of tennis, boating, fishing, and parties. But even this chapter would come to an end. On a winter day in late 1961, Marjorie Gilbert Bourne Thayer prepared to make a decision that would end the Bourne family's 60-year connection to Dark Island. She was 71 years old. Alec was 73. They had no children, and she knew her time was running short. On December 27, 1961, Marjorie sold Dark Island to LaSalle Military Academy for less than $100. It was a gift, really. A final act of generosity to an institution that had once been her childhood home. After Frederick Bourne's death in 1919, his estate at Indian Neck Hall in Oakdale, Long Island, the grand 110-room mansion with the ballroom and pipe organ, had been sold in 1926 to the Brothers of the Christian Schools, a Catholic order. They had converted it into LaSalle Military Academy, and for decades it had served as a prestigious boarding school. Now Marjorie was giving them Dark Island as well. In 1962, at the age of 72, Marjorie died. Alec outlived her for 6 more years, but he never returned to Dark Island. The castle, the island, the summers by the river, all of it was too painful without her. He died in 1968, and with his death, the last direct connection between the Bourne-Thayer family and Dark Island was severed. The Brothers of the Christian Schools found themselves in possession of a medieval castle on a remote island in the middle of a river. They had no idea what to do with it. LaSalle Military Academy was based in Oakdale, Long Island. Their students were cadets in training, not island vacationers. The logistics of maintaining a property that could only be accessed by boat, that had no running water from municipal sources, that relied on generators for electricity, that froze solid in winter. These were insurmountable challenges for a school with limited resources. So for 3 years, from 1962 to 1965, Dark Island sat largely abandoned. Ice engulfed it every winter. The castle's walls withstood the freezing temperatures, but the interior began to suffer. Pipes froze and burst, wallpaper peeled, dampness crept into the rooms. Some furnishings were removed, some were stolen, and some simply rotted where they sat. In April 1965, the Christian Brothers sold Dark Island for $35,000 to the Harold Martin Evangelistic Association, a religious charity established by Dr. Harold George Martin, a former chaplain to the Royal Canadian Air Force. Dr. Harold Martin was born in Quebec, but had Norwegian ancestry. His grandfather's original family name was Martin Jorstad, and when Dr. Martin and his wife Eloise took possession of Dark Island, they renamed it Jorstad Castle. The Martins had a vision for the property. They would use it as a private retreat for ministers and missionaries, a place where religious workers could come to rest, pray, and recharge. They converted the breakfast room into a chapel and held religious services there every Sunday morning during the summer months, opening the services to the public. The arrangement was idyllic at first. The castle had a new purpose, but complications soon arose. Dark Island had been designated as tax-exempt property when it was owned by the Christian Brothers because it was owned by a religious institution. When the Harold Martin Evangelistic Association took over, they assumed the tax-exempt status would continue. But neighbors began to challenge this. They contended that Dr. Martin and his wife were using the tax-exempt property not for religious purposes, but as their own private summer residence. The dispute went to court. Dr. Martin defended himself, arguing that because he and Eloise offered religious services every Sunday morning that were open to all, the property qualified for tax-exempt status. The court agreed, and the Martins won. But the victory came at a cost. The legal battle had put Jorstad Castle in the public eye in ways that weren't entirely flattering. Rumors began to circulate. People whispered about the true use of the property. Why was it called Jorstad instead of something that identified its religious ownership? What were the Martins really doing there? The castle's name change didn't help, calling it Jorstad Castle instead of Singer Castle or Dark Island Castle confused visitors and locals alike. And as the years passed and the Martins aged, they found it increasingly difficult to maintain the property. By 1985, health issues meant the Martins could no longer visit Dark Island regularly. They put it on the market for $5 million, a staggering sum that reflected both the castle's grandeur and the difficulty of maintaining it. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, advertisements appeared in high-end real estate magazines like Unique Homes, suggesting the castle could be used as a private residence, corporate retreat, or hunting lodge. Interest came from as far away as Japan. Michael Jackson himself, at the height of his fame in the 1980s, made an offer to buy the castle. The Martins turned him down. For decades, the castle remained unsold. And during this time, the decline accelerated. Theft became a problem. Original fixtures, furnishings, and artifacts disappeared. Some were taken by opportunistic trespassers. Some may have been removed by people claiming to preserve them. The exact fate of many of the castle's original contents remains unknown. Maintenance was expensive and ongoing. The generators needed constant repair. The heating systems failed. The secret passageways, always dimly lit, became outright dangerous as electrical wiring deteriorated. Stories spread about people getting lost in the maze of passages, unable to find their way out. The dungeon, already ominous, took on an even darker reputation. The romantic mystique of Dark Island grew. It became known as the Castle of Mysteries, a place of legend and folklore. The secret passageways, the dungeon, the gradual deterioration, the rumors about its past, all of these fed a narrative that was part truth, part exaggeration, and entirely compelling. Finally, in 2001, the castle found new owners. Dark Island Tours, Incorporated, venture led by German businessman Farhad Vladi and two European business partners, purchased the property. Vladi operated Vladi Private Islands GmbH, a Hamburg-based real estate company specializing in selling islands around the world. He saw potential in Dark Island that others had missed. The new owners undertook an extensive campaign of restoration. They stabilized the structure, repaired the most critical damage, and adapted the castle for a new purpose: tourism. In 2003, tours began. Visitors could now come to Dark Island, climb the stone steps from the boathouse, and walk through the castle that had been closed to the public for so long. Despite the losses over the years, the interior retained much of its original character. Many of the Bourne Thayer furnishings remained in place. The library still held books from the family's personal collection. The architectural details that made the castle extraordinary were intact. Unlike Bolt Castle, which had become a tourist attraction decades earlier, Dark Island had always remained a private residence until this moment. It had never been open to the public while the Bournes lived there, nor during the Thayer years, nor even fully during the Martin era. This made it rare. A Gilded Age castle that had remained essentially unchanged since its construction. The castle's name was changed back to Singer Castle, honoring Frederick Bourne's connection to the Singer Manufacturing Company and providing a clearer identity for marketing purposes. In 2006, Dark Island was listed for sale through Sotheby's International Realty for $22 million. Later listings raised the price to $24.5 million. The castle remained on the market even as tours continued, becoming one of the most famous landmarks in the Thousand Islands region. Today, Singer Castle attracts approximately 35,000 visitors per season. Guided tours lead guests through the Great Hall, library, drawing room, clock tower, and portions of the hidden corridor network. The Royal Suite, occupying one wing of the castle, is available for overnight stays, allowing guests to sleep where the Bournes once entertained America's elite. The castle has also become a popular wedding venue, with its Gothic architecture and riverside setting providing a dramatic backdrop for ceremonies and receptions. To stand in Singer Castle today is to stand at the intersection of American ambition and American tragedy. The stones that form its walls were quarried by immigrant laborers working for wages Frederick Bourne could have paid with pocket change. The hidden corridors that seemed so charming were built so that working-class servants could remain invisible, moving through the house like ghosts while the wealthy pretended they didn't exist. The castle represents the best and worst of the Gilded Age. Yes, Frederick Bourne was a self-made man who rose from poverty through intelligence and hard work. Yes, he was charitable to his community, giving money to build fire stations and improve railroad infrastructure. Yes, he believed in making sewing machines affordable for ordinary families, genuinely helping to improve women's lives. But he was also a man who accumulated wealth on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. While millions of Americans lived in poverty, he built multiple massive estates. While factory workers labored in dangerous conditions for a few dollars a week, he entertained in rooms that cost more to furnish than most families would earn in a lifetime. And when he died, his children fought over his fortune with a greed that shocked even the jaded newspapers of the 1920s. The hidden corridors weren't romantic. They were practical tools of class separation, designed to keep servants out of sight and out of mind. The dungeon wasn't a playful architectural flourish. It was a dark, cold pit that served no clear purpose except to evoke medieval power and dominance. The castle's isolation on Dark Island wasn't just about privacy. It was about creating a world where the wealthy could do whatever they wanted, far from the eyes of law enforcement or public scrutiny. The rumors of bootlegging during Prohibition, whether true or not, speak to a larger truth. The wealthy have always lived by different rules. While ordinary Americans were arrested and jailed for having a bottle of whiskey in their homes, the elite moved liquor through private channels with relative impunity. The Prohibition era was a time when laws were enforced selectively, when the poor suffered while the rich laughed. And the gradual decay of the castle after Frederick's death. That wasn't just about logistics or economics. It was about the inevitable truth that empires built by individuals cannot outlast those individuals. Frederick's children couldn't maintain what he had built because they hadn't built it. They had merely inherited it. And inheritance without the vision and drive that created the wealth in the first place leads only to decline. Singer Castle is not unique. Across America, the Gilded Age produced hundreds of massive estates built by robber barons and industrial titans who believed their wealth and power would last forever. Most of those estates are gone now. Demolished, burned, subdivided, converted to schools or hospitals, or left to rot. Indian Neck Hall, Frederick Bourne's Long Island mansion, still stands, but not as a family home. It was sold after his death, became LaSalle Military Academy, and is now owned by St. John's University. In 2016, it was sold again to the AMD Education Group for $22.5 million. The Bourne family hasn't owned it for over a century. William Kissam Vanderbilt's Idle Hour, the neighboring estate, was also converted to educational use and is now part of what was Dowling College. The grand ballrooms where Bourne and Vanderbilt entertained are now classrooms. The private docks where their yachts once moored are part of public waterfront. This is the pattern of Gilded Age estates. They were built as monuments to individual achievement, but they could not survive as such. They were too expensive to maintain. They required too many servants. And most importantly, they represented values that a changing America was leaving behind. The tragedies that befell the Bourne family, Emma's death, Howard's death, Frederick's death, the bitter legal battles, the eventual loss of both estates, these were not unusual. This was the standard trajectory for Gilded Age families. Enormous wealth accumulated in one generation was often squandered or fragmented in the next. The children who grew up in luxury rarely had the drive or ability to maintain it. And yet, there is something almost fitting about Singer Castle's survival. Unlike Indian Neck Hall, which was sold and repurposed, Dark Island remained in the Bourne family for 43 years after Frederick's death. Marjorie and Alec Thayer loved the castle and lived there every summer for nearly 4 decades. They added to it. They cared for it. And when they could no longer maintain it, they gave it to an institution they trusted. The Martin years, though controversial, kept the castle from being demolished or developed. The long period on the market, frustrating as it must have been for the sellers, meant the castle wasn't snapped up by a buyer who might have gutted it for modern renovations. And today's incarnation as a tourist attraction and event venue, it's not what Frederick Bourne envisioned, but it ensures the castle will survive. It allows thousands of people to experience a piece of history they could never otherwise access. It turns an exclusive monument to wealth into something approaching a public resource. What is Singer Castle's real legacy? Is it the architectural marvel created by Ernest Flagg, bringing a Scottish novel to life in upstate New York? Is it Frederick Bourne's rags to riches story, proof that American capitalism could reward merit and ambition? Is it the family drama, the legal battles, the alleged rum running, the decades of decay? Is it the current restoration, turning a private monument into a public attraction? Perhaps it is all of these things. Perhaps the castle's greatest legacy is that it forces us to confront the complexity of American history. It doesn't let us paint the Gilded Age in simple terms. It shows us ambition and greed, innovation and exploitation, beauty and darkness, all existing in the same stone walls. The hidden corridors are a perfect metaphor. On the surface, the castle is grand and impressive. But concealed within the walls are darker channels, unseen pathways, spaces where the reality was very different from the public face. This was true of the building, and it was true of the era that built it. When visitors walk through Singer Castle today, they often ask the same questions. Why so many hidden rooms? Why a dungeon? What really happened here during Prohibition? Why did the family fight so bitterly over the inheritance? Why did the castle fall into such disrepair? These questions don't have simple answers. And that's appropriate, because history doesn't have simple answers. The Gilded Age was a time of tremendous progress and terrible inequality. Frederick Bourne was simultaneously a self-made genius and a beneficiary of systems that exploited workers. The castle is both an architectural masterpiece and a monument to excess. The tragedy of Singer Castle is not just that Emma and Howard died, or that Frederick's children fought over his money, or that the castle fell into disrepair. The tragedy is that for all Frederick Bourne's success and wealth, he could not escape the universal human experiences of loss, grief, and mortality. His money could not save his wife or his son. His fortress could not protect his family from dissolution. His hidden corridors led nowhere but back to the truth he spent his life trying to outrun: that all empires fall, all fortunes scatter, and all that remains is stone and memory. Today, if you take a boat out to Dark Island, the castle greets you as it has for over a century. But the greeting is different now. Those stone walls that once knew only the footsteps of millionaires now welcome tourists and honeymooners. The boathouses that sheltered Bourne's steam yachts now dock water taxis and tour boats. Walk through the entrance, and you'll find rooms that breathe with history. The great hall where Bourne once entertained Cornelius Vanderbilt and J.P. Morgan. The library where Marjorie and Alec Thayer spent quiet evenings reading. The clock tower that still marks time, indifferent to who owns the hours below. But venture deeper into the narrow spaces between the walls, and you'll feel something shift. The hidden corridors are darker than photographs suggest. Cooler. The viewing grates peer into empty rooms like dead eyes. The dungeon sits in its foundation pit, waiting for a purpose that never came and never will. In summer, wedding guests dance in rooms where the Bourne children once played. Overnight visitors sleep in beds positioned where servants once rushed through hidden doors. Tour groups photograph architectural details that were meant to intimidate, not inspire. The castle has become something Frederick Bourne never imagined. Democratic. Singer Castle is no longer a fortress. It is no longer a symbol of power or wealth. It is something stranger. A monument to impermanence dressed in permanent stone. It stands at the border between two countries, between past and present, between the dreams we build and the ruins we become. Frederick Gilbert Bourne believed he was building something eternal, a dynasty, a legacy written in granite and imported Spanish tiles. And in the cruelest possible way, he succeeded. The building endures. But it endures without him, without his family, without any memory of what it felt like when these halls were home rather than exhibition. The true tragedy is not that the castle survived while the family did not. It's that the castle's survival renders the family almost invisible. Most visitors don't know Frederick Bourne's name. They don't know about Emma's death or Howard's death or the bitter lawsuits. They know the Singer mansion. They know the hidden rooms. They know the ghost stories. But they don't know the man who started with nothing and ended with everything, only to discover that everything and nothing look remarkably similar when you're dying. Perhaps this is fitting. The castle was always about secrets, corridors within walls, rooms within rooms, truths hidden behind stone. And the greatest secret is the one the castle keeps now. That all monuments eventually forget the people they were meant to remember. The Westminster chimes ring out across the water. The waves crash against the rocky shore. Tourists take photographs and leave, and the castle remains, beautiful and hollow. A shell inhabited only by echoes of laughter from a century ago, whispers of servants long dead, and the sound of footsteps that could be visitors or could be ghosts. Impossible to tell which, and ultimately, impossible to care. Singer Castle endures. But what it preserves is not Frederick Bourne's dream of permanence. It preserves instead the lesson he learned too late. That stone outlasts ambition, that buildings outlast builders, and that the only thing more tragic than being forgotten is being remembered only as the man who built walls that would one day hold nothing but emptiness and wind.